You are standing on a rocky shoreline in the year 1021. The wind is cold. The grass is the wrong shade of green for anywhere you have ever been. A wooden ship with a curved prow is pulled up onto the beach behind you, and the people stepping off it are not who your history class told you to expect. This is not 1492. This is not Columbus. This is almost 500 years earlier. And you are watching Norse sailors walk onto the coast of North America like it is just another Tuesday. Here is the strange part. For centuries, almost nobody believed this happened at all. It sounded like a myth, a fireside story, the kind of thing Vikings told to make themselves sound braver than they were. But the real story is far stranger than the myth, because it turns out the myth was mostly true, the official history was mostly wrong. And the whole idea of a single person discovering America was never really about discovery at all. Think about what you were taught. A brave explorer crosses an empty ocean. He finds an empty land. He plants a flag and history begins. That is the version on the poster. That is the version on the calendar. And almost none of it survives contact with the evidence. Start with the word empty. When Columbus's ships reached the Caribbean in 1492, the land he stepped onto held an estimated 60 million people. Cities, trade routes, farming systems that reshaped entire landscapes. The idea of an empty continent waiting to be found was never true. It was a story that made conquest sound like discovery and discovery sound like destiny. Now think about the word first. Because even by the narrow definition of first European to reach North America, Columbus was not it. Not close. For that, you need to go back to Norse sagas. Two of them, actually, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Both describe a Norse expedition led by a man named Leif Erikson, sailing west from Greenland and landing somewhere they called Vinland. Grapes grew there, or something the Norse mistook for grapes. Wild wheat grew there. It sounded like paradise compared to the ice of Greenland. For most of modern history, this was treated as legend. A good story. Passed down, exaggerated at every telling. Historians assumed the Norse never got farther than Greenland's own coastline. Why would they believe otherwise? There was no proof. There was only a story. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad went looking anyway. He did something almost nobody had thought to do. He took the sagas seriously as a literal map, not just a legend. And he sailed the coastline of Newfoundland asking local fishermen a simple question. Had anyone ever found old, strange foundations near the shore? An old man named George Decker had an answer. He knew a place. Locals called it by a name that had nothing to do with Vikings. They called it Elance Orks Meadows. What Ingstad found there, and what his wife, archaeologist Anne Stine Ingstad, spent years carefully excavating, was not a legend. It was a Norse settlement. Sod-walled buildings shaped exactly like the ones back in Iceland and Greenland. A blacksmith's forge. A carpentry area with wood shavings still in the soil. An iron rivet of the exact kind used in Norse shipbuilding. You can feel what that moment must have been like. Decades of dismissing a story as fantasy, and then the ground itself disagreeing with you. But here is the part that makes this more than an old discovery. The story did not end in the 1960s. It got sharper. In 2021, a researcher named Margot Kuitems at the University of Groningen led a team trained to answer a question that had never been settled. Not roughly when the Norse were at Elance Orks Meadows. Exactly when? Their method sounds almost too clever to be real. In the year 993, a massive solar storm blasted the Earth with radiation so intense it left a chemical fingerprint in that year's tree rings. All over the planet, visible in the carbon-14 levels of wood that was growing at that exact time. Kuitems and her team found preserved wood at the site, cut by Norse tools with metal blades, still carrying bark. They counted the growth rings outward from that one radioactive year like counting backward from a marked page in a book. The wood had been cut in the year 1021. Not around 1021. Not sometime in the 11th century. The year 1021, precisely, verified by the sun itself. It is, to this day, the only site in the Americas where archaeologists can name the exact year Europeans were present, and it happened 471 years before Columbus ever left Spain. So why does almost nobody build a national holiday around Leif Erikson? Why does the calendar not stop for him? Because the Norse never treated Vinland as a discovery. They treated it as a resource run. They came, they cut timber their own islands lacked. They clashed with the people already living there, people the sagas call the Skrælings, and after a few difficult years they left. No permanent colony, No claim sent home to a king eager to expand an empire. No story that served a growing nation's need for an origin myth. Columbus, on the other hand, arrived at exactly the right moment for a very different kind of story. A newly unified Spain wanted glory. A Europe hungry for a new trade route to Asia wanted an alternative. A growing colonial machine wanted a founding hero, a name to put on the myth of a virgin continent open for the taking. Columbus fit the need, so the need rewrote him as first, even though he was not, and even though he never once set foot on the mainland of North America in his entire life. This is what almost nobody tells you when they hand you the poster version of history. Discovery was never really a measurement of who arrived somewhere first. It was a story about whose arrival was useful to remember. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere, not just in 1492. You see it in how museums choose which explorer's portrait hangs at the entrance. You see it in how the word pioneer gets applied to some people crossing land and never to others already living on it. You see it in the way a name spreads across a map, while an older name, spoken for thousands of years before it, quietly disappears from the same map. Here is the question worth sitting with. How much of what you consider a settled fact is actually a settled story? Something repeated so often, taught so early, printed on so many calendars, that it stopped feeling like a claim and started feeling like a memory. You do this on a smaller scale constantly. You remember being the one who found a great restaurant, even if a friend mentioned it first. You remember being early to a trend, conveniently forgetting the person who told you about it. Not because you are lying, because your mind, like a nation writing its own founding myth, prefers a clean story where you are the discoverer, over a messy truth where you were simply told. That rocky shoreline in Newfoundland is still there. The sod wall outlines are still visible if you visit low green mounds where a forge and a workshop once stood. Nothing about that site is a myth anymore. It is dated, excavated, published, undeniable. And somewhere on that same continent, at the exact same time, those Norse sailors were cutting timber. Entire cities of people who had lived there for thousands of years watched a strange ship arrive on their coast and thought exactly what you would think. Someone new has just shown up, but this land was never empty. It was never waiting. It was never lost. It was only ever waiting for someone to write down a story that made it sound that way.